Sometimes the ones who've lost everything are the only ones who can truly save someone else. In a dying frontier town where hope had become as scarce as rain, Jake Tiller was just another forgotten cowboy, his glory days long behind him, his purpose worn down to nothing. Then one morning, a stray dog dragged a saddle through the dust and stopped right at his feet, its eyes begging for something Jake hadn't given in years: help. What that dog led him to that day would change everything he thought he knew about himself. A young girl, alone and barely alive, hidden in a place where no one would think to look. But why did the dog choose Jake? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Dustwater sat in a valley that time had decided to forget. Once, it had been something, not grand but decent. A place where ranchers brought their cattle, where families came on Saturdays to buy supplies and swap stories, where the sound of horses and wagon wheels filled the streets from dawn until dusk. But those days had slipped away like water through cupped hands, leaving behind only empty storefronts with sun-bleached signs and a handful of stubborn souls who refused to admit the town was dying. Jake Tiller's workshop occupied a lean-to shed behind what used to be Mercer's general store. It wasn't much: 4 walls of weathered pine, a slanted roof that leaked in 3 places, and a dirt floor he'd packed down himself over the years. But it was his, or at least Martha Henshaw let him pretend it was. She owned the general store. Now, had inherited it from her father, and she'd told Jake he could stay as long as he needed. That was 5 years ago, right after Sarah died, and the bank took the ranch. The workshop smelled of leather and neat's foot oil, of saddle soap and the particular musk of old wood. Jake had built himself a workbench from salvaged planks, sturdy, enough to hold his weight when he needed to lean into a stubborn repair. His tools hung on the wall in careful order: awls and needles, knives and edge bevelers, all arranged the way his father had taught him 40 years back. A man's tools should have a place, his father used to say, so his hands know where to reach, even when his mind is wandering. Jake was 58 years old, though some days he felt closer to 80. His face carried the map of a life spent outdoors, lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into the sun, weathered skin the color of old saddle leather, a white scar across his left cheek from a disagreement with a fence post when he was 19. His hair, mostly gray now, stayed pushed back under a sweat-stained Stetson he'd owned since his 20s. The hat had seen better days, but then again, so had Jake. The knee bothered him most mornings. He'd busted it in a rodeo accident back, when he was still young enough to think himself invincible, a bad landing from a bull that had other ideas about being ridden. The doctors had patched it up well enough, but 30 years of ranch work hadn't done it any favors. Now it ached when rain was coming, stiffened up in the cold, and reminded him with every step that he wasn't the man he used to be. He'd been working on a saddle repair that morning, his leather tool belt cinched around his waist, like always. That belt had been with him longer than most anything else, a gift from Sarah on their first anniversary. She'd had his initials tooled into the leather, right above the buckle. J.T. He ran his thumb over those letters sometimes, when the silence got too heavy, when the memories pressed in too close. The saddle belonged to Tom Bradshaw, one of the few ranchers still working the land around Dustwater. Simple job, reinforcing some stitching, replacing a worn cinch ring. Jake worked slowly, methodically, his hands moving through motions they'd performed 1,000 times. There was comfort in the work, in the repetition. It didn't ask questions, it didn't expect answers. Through the open door of his workshop, he could see Main Street, or what was left of it, Mercer's general store, where Martha still opened every day despite having maybe 3 customers. The old saloon, boarded up now for a decade. Doc Henley's office, where the doctor spent most days reading medical journals and waiting for someone to need him. The post office, which stayed open 2 days a week. And at the far end of the street, The church, with its white steeple, still standing proud, even as everything around it crumbled. Martha Henshaw was the closest thing Jake had to family now. She was in her early 60s, a sturdy woman with steel-grey hair she kept in a practical bun and hands that still remembered how to work. Her husband had died in the same accident that took Sarah, a car collision on the highway heading into the next town over. 2 vehicles, a moment of inattention, and 4 lives changed forever. Martha had buried her grief in work, keeping the store running through sheer stubbornness. She and Jake had an understanding born of shared loss. They didn't talk about it much, but it was there between them, a quiet recognition that they'd both survived something that should have broken them. She brought him coffee most mornings before the store opened, strong and black the way he liked it. They'd sit on the porch of the general store and watch the sun come up over the valley, not saying much, just being there. It was a ritual that mattered more than either of them would admit. Old Pete Carmichael was another fixture in Jake's small world. Pete had to be pushing 75 now, a bantam rooster of a man with a voice like gravel and opinions on everything. He'd worked cattle his whole life until his sons sold the family ranch and moved to Denver. Now he lived in a small house at the edge of town, spent his days whittling on the bench outside the general store, and complained about everything from the weather to the government to the sorry state of young people these days, though there weren't many young people left to complain about. Doc Henley rounded out the group. Samuel Henley had been Dustwater's physician for 40 years, had delivered most of the children born in town, including Jake himself. He was 72, tall and thin, with wispy white hair and gentle hands that trembled slightly now from age. His office still had all the equipment from better days, an examination table, cabinets full of medical supplies, even an old X-ray machine that probably didn't work anymore. The doc made house calls when needed, which wasn't often. Mostly he read, waited and worried about what would happen to the town when he was gone. These were Jake's people now, not family by blood, but by something else. By the simple fact that they'd all stayed when everyone else had the good sense to leave. Jake's days followed a pattern as worn as the grooves in his workbench. Wake at dawn, make coffee on the hot plate in the corner of his workshop, work on whatever repairs had come in. Lunch was usually something simple from Martha's store. Crackers and cheese, maybe some jerky. Afternoons he'd sweep out the workshop, organize tools, sometimes walk down to the creek at the edge of town just to move his bad knee before it seized up completely. Evenings, he'd sit on an overturned crate outside his door and watch the light fade from the valley, nursing a beer if he had one, trying not to think too hard about how he'd gotten here. The ranch had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. Not a big spread, but enough. 300 acres of decent grazing land, a sturdy house Sarah had loved, a barn that smelled like hay and horses. They'd run cattle, kept it modest, made enough to get by. It had been a good life. Simple, but good. Then Sarah got sick. Cancer, the kind that moved fast and didn't care about prayers or promises. The medical bills came first, then the missed payments on the ranch loan, then the foreclosure notice. Jake had fought it, but fighting don't change math, and the numbers weren't in his favor. 6 months after they buried Sarah, the bank auctioned off everything. The land, the cattle, the house with all its memories. Jake had moved into the workshop with what little he owned. His tools, some clothes, a box of photographs he couldn't quite bring himself to look at. Martha had offered him the spare room above the store, but he'd declined. The workshop suited him. It was small enough that the emptiness didn't echo quite so loud. He knew what people thought, that he'd given up, that he was just going through the motions, waiting for time to run out. Maybe they were right. He fixed their saddles and repaired their boots and took whatever money they offered, and he didn't think much about tomorrow because tomorrow looked a lot like yesterday, and yesterday hadn't been particularly worth repeating. But underneath all that, buried deep where he tried not to look, there was still something, a small coal of who he used to be, not quite extinguished. Some days he'd catch himself in the mirror and see a flash of the young man who'd won Sarah's heart. The rancher who'd worked sun up to sundown and felt good about it. The neighbor who'd ride out in a storm to help someone with a downed fence. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd known in another life. The truth was, Jake had stopped believing he mattered much. Oh, people were polite enough, asked him how he was doing, told him his work was appreciated, but he could feel it, that careful distance people keep from someone who's had too much bad luck, like tragedy might be contagious. He'd become part of the town's scenery, as fixed and unremarkable as the faded signs on the boarded-up buildings. He told himself he was fine with it, told himself a man his age didn't need purpose or meaning, just needed to keep his head down and his hands busy until his time came. Told himself a lot of things that didn't quite ring true when he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence. The afternoon was wearing thin when Jake finished with Tom's saddle. He set it aside, wiped down his tools, and hung his leather belt on its peg by the door. His back ached from bending over the workbench, and his knee was stiff as a board. He needed to walk a bit, get the blood moving. He stepped outside, squinting in the slanted sunlight. The street was empty, except for Pete whittling on his usual bench, and a pair of ravens arguing over something in the dirt. The air smelled like dust and distance, like it always did this time of year, when the valley was waiting for rain that might or might not come. Jake stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, not going anywhere in particular, just standing. This was his life now. This quiet, fading place where nothing much happened and nothing much changed. He'd made his peace with it, or thought he had. He couldn't have known. Standing there in the dusty street of Dustwater, with the sun sinking low, and the ravens calling their harsh complaints to the sky, that tomorrow morning everything would change. That a scruffy dog with determined eyes would drag something heavy through the dust and stop right at his feet, looking up at him, like he was the answer to a question Jake didn't even know had been asked. Sometimes Providence works in strange ways. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs, dragging a burden too heavy for its small frame, seeking out the one person who's forgotten they still have something to give. But that was tomorrow. Today, Jake just stood in the empty street, feeling the ache in his knee and the bigger ache in his chest that had no name. Watching the light fade from another day that had come and gone without leaving much mark at all. The morning came like any other, with weak sunlight filtering through the gaps in the workshop walls, and the sound of Martha's boots on the porch boards as she arrived with coffee. Jake had been awake for an hour already, his knee throbbing dully, lying on his narrow cot and staring at the ceiling, counting the knots in the wood planks because it was something to do besides think. He pulled himself upright with a grunt, worked his leg until the joint cooperated, and shuffled to the door. Martha handed him the steaming cup without a word, just the small nod they'd perfected over the years, a greeting that acknowledged presence without demanding conversation. They sat on the porch as the town woke around them, which was to say it barely woke at all. A few birds, the creak of the general store sign swinging in a breeze too slight to feel. Pete Carmichael's door opening and closing as he headed out for his morning constitutional down to the creek and back. Jake was halfway through his coffee when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a scraping, dragging sound, rhythmic and determined. He looked up to see something coming down the middle of Main Street, something that made him squint because his eyes had to be playing tricks. A dog, medium-sized, brown and white, some kind of cattle dog mix by the look of it. Thin but not starved, coat dusty but not mangy. And behind the dog, dragging in the dirt with each labored step, was a saddle. A full-sized working saddle, far too heavy for an animal that size to be pulling. Yet here it was, one strap clenched firmly in the dog's jaws, head lowered with effort, paws digging into the packed earth with each forward lunge. Martha saw it too. "Well," she said softly, "that's something you don't see every day." The dog came straight toward them, not wandering, not sniffing around, coming with purpose, as if it had a destination in mind, and that destination was Jake's workshop. When it reached the porch steps, it stopped, dropped the saddle strap from its mouth, and looked up at Jake with eyes that were remarkably clear, remarkably intelligent, and remarkably insistent. Jake set down his coffee and stood slowly, his knee protesting. The dog didn't move, just kept watching him with that steady gaze. Up close, Jake could see the animal was exhausted. Sides heaving, tongue lolling, paws scraped raw in places. But there was no desperation in its manner, no fear. Just determination, and something else Jake couldn't quite name. Expectation, maybe, or hope. "Where'd you come from, boy?" Jake asked quietly, though he could tell from the dog's build and manner it was female. He reached out a hand, let her sniff it. She licked his fingers once, then nudged his leg with her nose, turned back toward the street and barked. A single sharp bark that clearly meant "follow me." "Jake," Martha said, a note of warning in her voice. "That animal's trying to tell you something." "I can see that." The dog barked again, more urgently, then trotted a few steps away and looked back over her shoulder. The message was unmistakable. Jake looked at the saddle lying in the dust. It was old but well made, good leather work, the kind that lasted if you took care of it. Initials were tooled into the back of the cantle. RM. The saddle had been loved once, used by someone who knew what they were doing. It wasn't a piece of abandoned tack. Someone had needed this saddle, valued it. So why was a dog dragging it through town? "You should follow her," Martha said. She'd come down the steps and was examining the saddle herself, running her fingers over the leather. "This didn't come from anyone local." "I'd know the work," Jake hesitated. His knee hurt, he had Tom's saddle to deliver, and chasing after stray dogs wasn't on his list of things to do today. But the dog barked again, more insistent, and something in that sound, something urgent and pleading, made the decision for him. "All right," he said to the dog. "Show me." The animal's whole body seemed to relax with relief. She turned and trotted down Main Street at a pace Jake could follow, stopping every dozen yards to make sure he was still coming. They passed Pete's house, past the church, past the last of the buildings, until the street became just a dirt road leading out into the scrubland beyond town. Jake's knee was screaming by the time they'd gone half a mile. The dog kept checking on him, adjusting her pace when he lagged, but never losing that sense of urgency. Whatever she wanted him to see, it mattered. They left the road and cut across open ground, heading toward a cluster of old cottonwood trees that marked where a seasonal creek ran, or used to run before the drought years. In the shade of those trees, mostly hidden by tall grass and scrub, Jake could make out the shape of something man-made, an old wagon, the kind settlers used a lifetime ago, half collapsed and missing its wheels. The dog broke into a run for the last stretch, disappearing into the tall grass. Jake followed as fast as his bad leg would allow, a feeling growing in his chest that he couldn't name, but that felt uncomfortably like fear. He found her sitting beside the wagon, whining softly, and in the wagon bed, curled up on some old blankets, was a child, a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, small for her age and painfully thin. Her dark hair was tangled and dusty, her face flushed with fever, her lips cracked and dry. She wore jeans and a t-shirt that had probably been blue once, but were now faded to grey. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing, shallow, rapid breaths that Jake recognized from his years raising cattle. Dehydration, exposure. The kid was in bad shape. The dog nuzzled the girl's hand, whimpering, then looked up at Jake with those clear, beseeching eyes. "Lord, have mercy," Jake breathed. He knelt beside the wagon, his knee howling in protest, and put his hand gently on the girl's forehead. Hot as a kettle. How long had she been out here? Where were her people? And how, in God's name, had a dog known to come find him? The girl stirred at his touch, her eyes fluttering open. They were brown, glazed with fever, unfocused. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. "Easy now," Jake said softly. "Easy. I'm going to help you. You understand? I'm going to get you back to town, get the doc to look at you." He wasn't sure she understood. Her eyes closed again and her head lolled to the side. The dog whined and licked the girl's face, then looked at Jake again, with an expression that was somehow both grateful and demanding. "You found her. Now fix this." Jake's mind was racing. The girl needed water immediately, needed medical attention, needed to be somewhere safe and warm. The wagon was at least half a mile from town, and there was no way his knee would hold if he tried to carry her that far. He needed help. He pulled off his shirt, wadded it up, and placed it under the girl's head as a pillow. Then he stroked the dog's head once. "You did good," he told her. "Real good. You stay with her, understand? I'm going back to get help, but I'm coming back. You watch over her." The dog seemed to understand. She lay down beside the girl, resting her head on the child's chest, and fixed Jake with a look that said, "Hurry." Jake stood, his knee nearly giving out, and started back toward town as fast as he could manage. He moved like he hadn't moved in years, ignoring the pain, ignoring the voice in his head that said he was too old and too broken for this. A child was dying in an abandoned wagon. Nothing else mattered. He found Pete first, sweeping the steps of the general store. "Get Doc Henley," Jake gasped. "Get him and anyone else who can help. There's a child out past the creek line, bad shape. We need to bring her in." Pete's eyes went wide, but he didn't waste time with questions. He dropped his broom and took off at a faster run than Jake would have thought the old man capable of. Within minutes, Doc Henley was hurrying down the street with his medical bag. Martha was grabbing blankets and water, and Tom Bradshaw had appeared with his truck. They piled into the truck bed, Jake, the doc, and Martha, while Tom drove as close to the wagon as the rough ground would allow. When they reached the spot, the dog was still there, still keeping watch, and the girl hadn't moved. Doc Henley went to work immediately, checking her pulse, her temperature, her breathing. "Severe dehydration," he muttered. "Fever. She needs fluids, needs to be somewhere clean." He looked at Jake. "How'd you find her?" Jake nodded toward the dog. "She found me. Dragged a saddle all the way into town, then led me straight here." The doctor glanced at the dog with something like wonder, then shook his head. "Well, thank God she did. Another day in this heat, and we'd be having a very different conversation." They wrapped the girl in blankets, Martha cradling her head, while Jake and Tom carefully lifted her into the truck bed. The dog jumped in without being asked, positioning herself next to the girl, and nobody tried to stop her as they drove back toward town. Jake watched the child's pale face and felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen for 5 years starting to thaw. This girl, this dog, this moment, it meant something. He didn't know what yet, but he could feel it, certain as sunrise. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Tiller had a purpose. Someone needed him, and that changed everything. Doc Henley set up his examination room like he was preparing for surgery, though what he mostly needed was already flowing through the IV line he'd carefully inserted into the girl's thin arm. Fluids, electrolytes, something to bring down the fever. Martha had fetched clean sheets from the store, and they'd made up the old examination table into something resembling a proper bed. The girl hadn't woken. Not really. She'd stirred a few times, mumbled words nobody could understand, then slipped back into fevered sleep. The dog hadn't left her side, lying on the floor next to the table with her head on her paws, watching everything with those intelligent eyes. Jake stood near the window, trying to stay out of the way, but unable to make himself leave. His knee throbbed from the morning's exertion, and he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. The adrenaline that had carried him through finding the girl was wearing off, leaving him shaky and uncertain. "She'll pull through," Doc Henley said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Young ones are tougher than they look. But Jake, she's been on her own out there for days, maybe longer. No telling what she's been through. Any idea who she is?" The doctor shook his head. "Nothing in her pockets. No identification. That dog's not wearing a collar either. It's like they just appeared out of nowhere." But people didn't just appear out of nowhere, Jake thought. The girl came from somewhere, belonged to someone, or had belonged to someone. The alternative, that she'd been abandoned, left to die in that wagon, was too terrible to consider. Though Jake knew the world could be cruel enough for such things, Martha was going through the blankets they'd found with the girl, folding them carefully despite their worn condition. She paused, her fingers finding something tucked into the folds. "Jake," she said softly, "look at this." It was a locket, small and silver, tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its simplicity. Martha opened it carefully. Inside were 2 photographs, old ones, the kind taken in those mall photo booths that used to be everywhere. On the left, a woman, young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair and a warm smile. On the right, the same woman holding a baby, looking down at the infant with such love it made Jake's chest ache. Her mother, you think? Martha asked. Jake took the locket, studying the photographs. The woman in the picture had the same shaped face as the girl lying on the examination table, the same dark hair. Seems likely. Past tense, Doc Henley said quietly. The way that child was out there alone, my guess is the mother's gone. Dead or left, or... He stopped himself, glancing at the girl as if afraid she might hear. Well, lots of possibilities, none of them good. Pete Carmichael arrived then, breathing hard from the walk. He'd gone back to retrieve the saddle the dog had dragged, figured someone should keep track of it. He leaned it against the wall of the examination room, and Jake found himself studying it again. The leather was quality, well-maintained despite its age. Those initials on the cantle, RM, were tooled with skill. Whoever owned this saddle had cared about it, used it for real work. I'm thinking, Pete said, catching his breath, that we should check with Sheriff Dawson over in Millbrook. See if anyone's been reported missing. A child this age, someone's got to be looking for her. Millbrook's 30 miles, Martha said. But you're right. We need to make some calls, see what we can find out. Doc Henley had pulled the blankets from the girl's wagon and was examining them more closely in the better light. One of them was different from the others. A quilt, handmade, the kind that told stories in its patches. Pieces of old shirts, dress fabric, what looked like scraps from a wedding dress. The stitching was careful, loving, the work of someone who knew their craft. This was made for her, the doctor said, running his fingers over the careful seams. See these patches? They're from different stages of life. Baby clothes here, school clothes there. Someone spent months making this, maybe years. This is the kind of thing a mother makes for her daughter. Jake took the quilt, feeling the weight of it, the hours of work represented in every stitch. It was faded now, worn from use, but still sturdy. A gift meant to last. He spread it carefully over the girl, tucking it around her thin shoulders. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, approving. The afternoon wore on. Martha made coffee, then soup that nobody ate. Pete made calls from the doctor's telephone, talking to Sheriff Dawson, to the state police, to anyone who might have information about a missing child. Tom Bradshaw stopped by with his wife, bringing more blankets and some of their granddaughter's old clothes that might fit once the girl was on her feet. Jake stayed. He couldn't have said exactly why, only that leaving felt wrong. He pulled a chair close to the examination table and sat there, his bad knees stretched out in front of him, watching the girl breathe. The dog had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from her ordeal, paws twitching occasionally in dreams. As evening shadows lengthened across the floor, the girl's fever began to break. Her breathing grew less labored, more regular. Color started returning to her cheeks. Doc Henley checked her vital signs and nodded with satisfaction. She's a fighter, he said. That's good. She's going to need that. Around dusk, the girl's eyes opened. Not the glazed, unfocused look from before, but truly awake. She blinked several times, trying to make sense of her surroundings, the white walls, the medical equipment, the faces of strangers looking down at her with concern. Her gaze found the dog first, and something in her expression relaxed. Then she looked at Jake, studying his weathered face, his worn cowboy hat, his calloused hands. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, rough from dehydration and disuse. You came. 2 words, but they carried weight. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something hoped for, but not quite believed. The dog came for me, Jake said gently. Dragged a saddle all the way into town. Led me right to you. That's one smart animal you've got there. A ghost of a smile touched the girl's cracked lips. Her name's Ruby. She was my grandpa's dog. She knows things, Ruby, Jake repeated. The dog's ears perked at the sound of her name. Well, Ruby's a hero. You'd have been in real trouble if she hadn't found help. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Grandpa said she'd know what to do. He said Ruby always knew. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. Past tense again. Your grandpa, where is he, sweetheart? The tears spilled over then, running down her thin cheeks. The girl shook her head, unable or unwilling to answer. Ruby whined and stood up, putting her paws on the edge of the examination table so she could lick the girl's hand. Doc Henley stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "That's enough for now. She needs rest. Questions can wait, but Jake needed to know one thing. What's your name, honey?" The girl looked at him with those brown eyes so full of grief and exhaustion and something else, a kind of guarded hope. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma McCrae. The initials on the saddle were R.M., her grandfather's saddle then. Ruby McCrae's saddle, probably, if Jake had to guess. Which meant wherever Emma had come from, whatever had happened to her, she'd started that journey on horseback with her grandfather and his faithful dog. "Emma," Jake said softly. "I'm Jake. You're safe now. You and Ruby both. Nobody's going to hurt you here." He meant it, even if he didn't yet understand the full weight of that promise. Even if he didn't yet realize that keeping Emma safe would require more from him than he'd given to anything in 5 years. Even if he didn't yet know that this moment, sitting in Doc Henley's examination room with a fevered child and a determined dog, was the moment his life began again. Emma's eyes were already closing, exhaustion and medicine pulling her back towards sleep. But she held onto Jake's hand with surprising strength, her small fingers wrapped around his calloused ones like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. "Promise," she mumbled, the words slurred with sleep. "Promise you won't leave." Jake Tiller, who hadn't made a promise to anyone in 5 years, who'd stopped believing his word meant much of anything, found himself answering without hesitation. "I promise." "Emma, I'm not going anywhere." The girl sighed, her grip relaxing, and slipped into real sleep, not the fevered unconsciousness of before, but genuine rest. Jake stayed where he was, her hand still in his, watching her breathe, and felt the weight of his promise settle over him like a mantle he'd thought he'd never wear again. Emma slept through the night and into the next morning, waking only briefly when Doc Henley changed her IV bag or when Ruby needed to go outside. Each time, her eyes would search the room until they found Jake, still sitting in his chair by the examination table, his bad knee propped on a stool Martha had brought him. Only when she'd confirmed his presence would she let herself drift back to sleep. Jake hadn't meant to stay the whole night. He'd told himself he'd just wait until she was stable, then head back to the workshop. But every time he tried to leave, Emma would stir, her hand reaching out as if sensing his intention, and he'd sit back down. So he stayed, dozing fitfully in the hard chair, his back aching and his knee complaining, but staying nonetheless. By mid-morning, Emma was awake enough to take water, then broth, then a few bites of the soft bread Martha had brought. She didn't say much, just watched Jake and Ruby with those serious brown eyes, as if trying to figure out if this was real or another fever dream. Doc Henley pronounced her out of immediate danger, but insistent she needed rest, good food, and time to regain her strength. "She's been through something significant," he told Jake quietly while Emma dozed. "Not just the physical ordeal of being out there. There's trauma here, deeper than dehydration and exposure." Jake had seen it too, in the way Emma flinched at sudden sounds, in the careful way she moved, like someone expecting the world to hurt her. Whatever had happened to her grandfather, whatever had brought her to that abandoned wagon, it had left marks that medicine couldn't treat. The question of what to do with Emma weighed heavy on everyone's mind. Sheriff Dawson had put out bulletins, checked missing person reports, made calls to surrounding counties. So far nothing. No one had reported a missing child matching Emma's description. No family had come forward. It was as if she'd materialized out of thin air. "We need to call social services," Doc Henley said on the second day. "She can't stay in my examination room indefinitely, and if there's no family—" "No." The word came out harder than Jake intended. Emma was sleeping again. Ruby curled against her side, and the thought of strangers coming to take her away made something fierce rise in his chest. "Not yet. Give it a few more days. Let her get stronger. Let Pete make a few more calls." Martha exchanged a glance with the doctor. "Jake," she said gently, "where's she going to stay?" Even if we wait on social services, she needs somewhere safe, somewhere comfortable. She can't sleep on an examination table forever. Jake knew where this was heading, knew what he was about to say before the words even formed. She can stay with me in the workshop. The workshop? Doc Henley repeated, his tone neutral but his meaning clear. Jake's workshop was barely large enough for one person, let alone a recovering child and a dog. I'll make it work, Jake said stubbornly. I've got the cot. I can sleep on the floor. There's room enough. Jake Tiller, Martha said, her hands on her hips in that way that meant she was about to tell him something he didn't want to hear. That workshop is not fit for a child. No proper bathroom, no kitchen, barely any heat. You're talking about taking in a little girl who's been through who knows what, and you want to have her sleep in a shed. She was right. Jake knew she was right. But the alternative, handing Emma over to the system, watching her disappear into foster care, breaking the promise he'd made, that was worse. The spare room, Martha said, her tone softening. Above the store. It's been empty since Bill died. It's got a real bed, a bathroom, even a small kitchen area. Emma can stay there. You too, if you want. Jake started to refuse. He'd turned down that room years ago, didn't want charity, but Martha held up a hand. This isn't about pride, Jake Tiller. This is about that little girl needing a safe place to heal. You want to take care of her? Fine, I think that's good. But you do it right, in a proper room with proper facilities. You hear me? Jake looked at Emma, at the careful way her quilt was tucked around her, the quilt her mother had made, patch by patch, stitch by stitch, hoping it would keep her daughter warm and safe. He thought about his own promises, about what Sarah would have said if she were here. Sarah, who'd always wanted children, but had never been blessed with them. All right, he said quietly. The spare room. And Martha, thank you. That afternoon, while Emma slept, Jake and Tom Bradshaw moved his few possessions from the workshop to the room above the store. It didn't take long. He owned so little. His clothes, his tools, the box of photographs. Martha had already prepared the space, cleaning it thoroughly, putting fresh linens on the two beds, one regular, one smaller that she'd borrowed from her niece. The room was simple but comfortable. Two beds separated by a nightstand, a small table with two chairs, a kitchenette with a hot plate and a sink. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with Martha's own quarters, but that was fine. Windows looked out over Main Street, and afternoon light filled the space with a warm glow. It's good, Tom said, setting down the last box. A good place for a kid to recover. Jake ran his hand over the smaller bed, thinking of Emma in that wagon, alone and frightened, waiting for someone to find her. She's been through too much already, he said quietly. I don't even know the half of it yet, but I can see it in her eyes. She's lost people, lost everything, probably. You're doing a good thing, Tom told him. Not everyone would step up like this, but Jake didn't feel like he was doing a good thing. He felt like he was fumbling through something he didn't understand, trying to help in the only way he knew how. He was 58 years old, alone, broken down in body and spirit. What did he know about taking care of a traumatized child? Yet when they brought Emma up to the room that evening, Doc Henley carrying her because she was still too weak to climb the stairs, Ruby following close behind, and she saw the beds, the clean space, the windows with curtains that Martha had hung just that afternoon. Something shifted in her expression. Is this... She started, then stopped, as if afraid to finish the question. This is where you'll stay, Jake said. You and Ruby, long as you need. With you, with me. I'll be right over there. He pointed to the other bed. Doc says you need to rest, get your strength back. Martha will help with anything you need. She's right downstairs. Emma looked around the room again, taking it all in, the beds, the table, the small touches Martha had added to make it welcoming. Her fingers found the locket around her neck, holding it tight. My grandpa, she said suddenly, her voice small. He got sick, real sick. We were traveling, trying to find... She stopped, swallowing hard. He told me to stay with the wagon, said he'd come back. But he didn't come back. And then Ruby, she knew. She knew he wasn't coming. So she dragged his saddle, found you, Jake's throat tightened. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that made his heart ache. A grandfather and granddaughter traveling alone, possibly fleeing from something or searching for somewhere better. The grandfather had gotten ill, probably went searching for help and never made it back. Emma had waited in that wagon alone until Ruby took matters into her own paws. "Your parents?" Jake asked gently. "Is there anyone we should call?" Emma shook her head. "Mama died 2 years ago, cancer. I never knew my daddy. Grandpa was all I had." The tears came then quietly, without sobs, just sliding down her cheeks like they'd been waiting for permission. He was all I had, and now Jake did the only thing he could think to do. He sat on the edge of her bed and put his arm around her thin shoulders, and Emma collapsed against him, crying in earnest now, all the grief and fear and exhaustion pouring out. Ruby pressed against her legs, whining softly, and Jake just held them both, this broken child and her faithful dog, and felt his own eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed in years. "I know," he said quietly, because he did know. He knew what it was to lose everyone, to be alone in a world that kept spinning even when your world had stopped. "I know, Emma, but you're not alone now. You hear me? You've got Ruby, and you've got me, and you've got this whole town. We're going to figure this out together." It was a promise he had no business making. He didn't know if he could keep it, didn't know what the future held, or what complications might arise. But Emma needed something to hold on to, and Jake found he needed it too, the sense of purpose, of mattering to someone, of having a reason to get up in the morning beyond just existing. When Emma's tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" "You don't even know me." Jake thought about that for a moment, thought about the empty years, the grief that had hollowed him out, the slow fade into irrelevance. Thought about Sarah, who would have welcomed this child without hesitation, who'd always believed that people were put in each other's paths for reasons that became clear in time. "Because Ruby chose me," he said finally. "And because sometimes we help people not because we know them, but because they need help and we can give it. That's reason enough." Emma studied his face, then nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied some question she'd been carrying. She lay back on the pillows, exhausted from crying, and pulled her mother's quilt up to her chin. Ruby jumped onto the bed without being invited, curling up at Emma's feet. "Jake," Emma said drowsily, her eyes already closing. "Yeah? Thank you." 2 simple words, but they hit Jake like a physical force. How long since someone had thanked him for anything that mattered? How long since he'd done something worthy of thanks? "You're welcome, Emma," he said softly. "Now get some rest." He watched her drift off to sleep, her breathing evening out, her face finally peaceful. Outside the windows, the sun was setting over Dustwater, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town was quiet as always, but somehow it felt different now. Like something had shifted, some possibility had opened up that hadn't existed before. Jake settled into his own bed, his body aching from 2 days without proper sleep, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. But tonight he had a child to watch over, a dog keeping vigil, and a promise he intended to keep. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The days took on a rhythm that surprised Jake with how natural it felt. He'd wake early, as always, but now, to the sound of Emma's quiet breathing from the other bed, Ruby's soft snores from the floor. He'd make coffee on the hot plate while trying to stay quiet, though Emma usually woke anyway, drawn by the smell and the comfort of routine. Breakfast was a shared affair in the small room. Oatmeal or eggs that Martha brought up, toast with butter, sometimes fruit when the grocery delivery came through. Emma ate slowly, carefully, her appetite returning bit by bit along with her strength. She didn't talk much in the mornings, just watched Jake with those thoughtful eyes. Ruby pressed against her leg under the table. Jake had moved his workbench into a corner of the room, and after breakfast he'd work on whatever repairs had come in while Emma read books that Martha had found for her. Old volumes from the store, stories about horses and frontier life that Emma seemed to lose herself in. Sometimes she'd just sit by the window, watching the empty street below, Ruby's head in her lap, and Jake would catch himself watching her instead of working, wondering what thoughts moved behind those serious eyes. A week after Emma had come into his life, she finally opened up about her grandfather. It was evening, the room lit by a single lamp, and Jake was oiling a harness while Emma sat on her bed with Ruby. His name was Raymond McCrae, she said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. Everyone called him Ray. He was the best man I ever knew. Jake set down the harness, giving her his full attention. Emma's fingers had found the locket around her neck again, that unconscious gesture she made whenever she was thinking about her mother. He raised horses, Emma continued. We had a small place in Wyoming near the mountains. Her voice caught. It was beautiful. Mama loved it there. Even when she got sick, she'd sit on the porch and watch the horses in the pasture. She said it was like watching freedom itself. Sounds like a good place, Jake said softly. It was. Until Mama died. Then Grandpa, he couldn't afford to keep it. The medical bills, they took everything. So we sold the horses, sold the land, and Grandpa said we'd head south, find work somewhere. He had a friend who owned a ranch in Texas, said he'd give Grandpa a job if we could get there. Jake began to understand. You were traveling to Texas, Emma nodded. Had our things in a wagon Grandpa bought cheap, his favorite horse pulling us. He packed his saddle, said a man might lose everything else, but he ought to keep his saddle. It was the one thing from his cowboy days that still meant something. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers working at the locket's clasp. When she opened it, Jake could see her looking at the photos inside. Her mother's face, the woman who'd made that quilt stitch by careful stitch. We made it through Wyoming and Colorado, okay, Emma said. But then Grandpa started feeling poorly. Coughing fever. He kept saying he was fine, that we just needed to keep moving. But he wasn't fine. By the time we got to this area, he could barely sit the horse. He should have found a doctor, Jake said, though he knew how the story ended. He tried. Found a clinic in some town, but they wanted money up front. We didn't have enough. So we kept going, and Grandpa kept getting worse. We made camp by those cottonwoods where you found me. Grandpa said to stay put, that he'd ride to the next town, find help, come back. But Emma's voice broke. Ruby whined and nuzzled her hand. He never came back, Jake finished gently. No, I waited 3 days. The water ran out. I got so hot, so thirsty. Ruby stayed with me, wouldn't leave even to hunt. I think she knew Grandpa wasn't coming back before I did. Dogs know things like that. Jake thought about that. A child alone in a wagon, slowly dying of thirst and heat, with only a loyal dog to keep her company. The courage it must have taken for Ruby to leave Emma's side, to drag that heavy saddle all the way into Dustwater looking for help. Ruby saved your life, he said. Grandpa used to say she was the smartest dog he'd ever known. Said she had a sixth sense about people, could tell the good ones from the bad. I guess she thought you were one of the good ones. Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd stopped thinking of himself as good or bad, just as someone existing, going through the motions. But this dog had chosen him, and this child had trusted that choice. Your grandfather's horse, Jake said. What happened to it? Emma's face fell. I don't know. When I came to, after you found me, Ruby was there, but the horse was gone. Maybe it wandered off looking for water. She couldn't finish the thought. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jake lay awake thinking about Raymond McCrae. A man who'd raised horses, loved his daughter, lost everything trying to save her, then lost his life trying to provide for his granddaughter. A man who'd kept his saddle because it meant something, represented something. A connection to who he'd been before tragedy reshaped his world. Jake understood that. He looked at his own tool belt hanging by the door. The initials Sarah had tooled into the leather. The things we keep, he thought, are the things that keep us. The next morning, Jake made a decision. After breakfast, he asked Martha to watch Emma for a few hours. Then he took Ruby and walked back out to where they'd found the wagon. It was a longer walk than he remembered, his knee protesting every step, but he kept going. The wagon was still there, undisturbed, slowly being reclaimed by grass and weather. Jake searched the area methodically, looking for any sign of Raymond McCrae or his horse. He found tracks, horse tracks leading away from the cottonwoods headed east. He followed them as far as his knee would allow, but they eventually vanished into harder ground. What he did find, caught on a sage bush about a quarter-mile from the wagon, was a pocket watch. Old silver, the kind a working man would carry. Jake opened it carefully. Inside the cover was an inscription, "To Ray with love, Margaret." Emma's grandmother, probably. The watch had stopped at 3:47, frozen at the moment it had fallen or been torn from Raymond's pocket. Jake closed the watch gently and put it in his pocket. It belonged to Emma now, one more piece of the grandfather she'd lost. On the way back to town, Ruby suddenly veered off the path, nose to the ground, tracking something. Jake followed her through the scrub until they came to a small depression in the earth, sheltered by rocks. And there, lying in the shade as if sleeping, was Raymond McCrae. He'd been dead for days, but the dry air had preserved him somewhat. He was an older man, maybe 70, with white hair and a weathered face that even in death held a kind of dignity. He'd made it this far from the wagon before whatever illness had been consuming him finally won. He died trying to find help for Emma, died moving forward even when his body was giving out. Jake stood there for a long moment, looking down at the man who'd loved his granddaughter enough to fight until the end. A man who'd been, in his own way, very much like Jake, someone who'd lost everything but kept going anyway because there was someone who needed him to keep going. "I've got her," Jake said aloud, his voice rough. "You're Emma, she's safe. And Ruby's a hero, Mr. McCrae. She did exactly what you raised her to do. You'd be proud." He marked the spot carefully, took note of landmarks, then headed back to town. There were arrangements to be made, people to notify. Sheriff Dawson would need to come out, and they'd need to give Raymond McCrae a proper burial. But first, Jake had to tell Emma that they'd found her grandfather, that the waiting and wondering were over. It was not a conversation he wanted to have, but Emma deserved the truth. Deserved to know that her grandfather hadn't abandoned her, had died trying to save her. Deserved the closure, painful as it was. When he got back to the room above the store, Emma took one look at his face and knew. "You found him," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jake sat beside her on the bed and pulled out the pocket watch, placing it gently in her small hand. "He made it about a mile from your wagon," he said. "He was still trying to get help when his time came. He didn't give up, Emma. He fought for you until the very end." Emma stared at the watch, her thumb tracing the inscription inside. Tears ran silently down her cheeks, but she didn't collapse like before. This grief was different, quieter, more final. The grief of knowing rather than wondering. Can we bury him properly?" she asked. "With a marker and everything?" "We can," Jake promised. "And we will. The whole town will turn out. We'll give him the respect he deserves." Emma nodded, still holding the watch, and Ruby pressed close against her. After a while she spoke again, so softly Jake almost missed it. "He would have liked you," she said. "Grandpa! He would have been glad it was you who found me." Jake felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built to keep the world at arm's length. He put his arm around Emma's thin shoulders, and they sat there together in the afternoon light, mourning a man neither of them could bring back. But both of them would remember. Outside, Dustwater went about its quiet business. But in that room above the store, something was being built, not just between a broken cowboy and a grieving child, but between two people who'd both lost everything and were slowly, carefully, beginning to find something worth holding on to. They buried Raymond McCrae on a hill overlooking the valley, in the cemetery where Dustwater's dead had rested for 100 years. The cemetery was small, like everything else in town, maybe 50 graves, most of them old, the markers weathered by time and wind. Sarah was there, in the newer section, and Jake hadn't visited in months. Couldn't bring himself to stand at her stone and face what he'd let himself become. But today wasn't about him. Today was about giving Emma's grandfather the dignity he'd earned, the respect he deserved for fighting until his last breath to save his granddaughter. The whole town turned out. Martha and Doc Henley, Pete Carmichael looking solemn in a suit he probably hadn't worn in years, Tom Bradshaw and his wife, Sheriff Dawson, who'd driven in from Millbrook, and a dozen others, people Jake barely knew anymore. people who'd become scenery in his small, contracted world. They came for Emma, and they came for the principle of the thing, that no man should be buried without witnesses, without someone to say his name and remember he existed. The pastor from the church, Reverend Wells, conducted the service. He was an old man himself, pushing 70, with a voice that still carried when he needed it to. He spoke of Raymond McCrae with the limited information they had, a horseman, a grandfather, a man who'd loved his family and fought for them, even when the world gave him every reason to quit. Emma stood at the graveside, in a simple black dress Martha had found. Her hand clutching Raymond's pocket watch, Ruby pressed against her leg. She didn't cry, but her face was pale and set, too old for her years. Jake stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and felt the weight of his promise settling deeper. When it came time for people to speak, if they wanted, there was a long silence. Then Emma stepped forward, her voice small but steady. "My grandpa taught me about horses," she said. "He taught me how to read the weather and how to tell if a horse was sound just by watching it move. He taught me that being good to animals was the same as being good to people. You had to earn trust. And once you earned it, you had to keep earning it every day." She paused, her thumb working over the watch in her hand. "He told me when Mama died that grief was like breaking a bone. It hurt terrible at first, then it ached for a long time, but eventually it healed if you let it. He said the bone would always remember being broken, would ache in the cold, remind you when the weather changed, but that didn't mean it couldn't be strong again, maybe even stronger than before in some ways." Emma looked up at the sky. "Clear and blue and endless. I think Grandpa's bone never got the chance to heal all the way before. Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. "But he kept going anyway, kept taking care of me, kept fighting. That's what I'll remember most. That he never quit, even when quitting would have been easier." She stepped back, and Jake squeezed her shoulder gently. Other people spoke then. Sheriff Dawson about the importance of family, Martha about the bonds that form in hard times, Doc Henley about the courage it takes to keep going when you've lost everything. When it was Jake's turn, he almost passed, uncomfortable with public speaking, uncomfortable with the weight of everyone's eyes on him. But Emma was watching, waiting, and he found himself moving forward anyway. "I never met Raymond McCrae," Jake said, his voice rough. "But I know what kind of man he was because of what he left behind. Not just Emma, though she's proof enough of good raising. Not just Ruby, though that dog's got more heart than most people I've known. But the fact that with his dying strength, sick and lost, and probably scared, he kept moving forward, trying to save his granddaughter, that tells you everything you need to know." Jake looked at the simple wooden cross they'd placed at the grave, the one Tom had carved with Raymond's name and dates. "I've spent 5 years feeling sorry for myself," Jake continued. "Lost my wife, lost my ranch, lost my purpose. Spent those years just existing, not really living, thinking my time for mattering was over. Then Emma came into my life, or rather Ruby dragged her way into my life, and reminded me that purpose doesn't end just because you're older or because you've been knocked down. Sometimes purpose finds you when you're not even looking for it." He paused, feeling the eyes of the town on him, feeling Emma's hand slip into his. "So thank you, Raymond McCrae," Jake said softly, "for raising a good child and a good dog, for fighting until you couldn't fight anymore, and for," his voice caught, "for trusting that someone would find Emma, that someone would care enough to help. I hope wherever you are, you know she's safe. You know she's loved, and you know I'll do everything I can to make sure she has the life you wanted for her." The service ended with Reverend Wells saying a prayer, and then people began drifting away, but not before each one stopped to speak to Emma, to tell her they were sorry for her loss, to assure her that Dustwater would take care of her. Martha hugged her tight. Doc Henley pressed a gentle hand to her head. Tom promised to teach her to ride when she was ready, said he had a gentle mare that needed exercise. When it was just Jake and Emma left at the graveside, with Ruby sitting patient and watchful, Emma finally spoke. "Do you think he knew?" she asked.
"Grandpa."
"Do you think he knew Ruby would find help in time?" Jake thought about that question, about faith and hope and the kind of trust it takes to send your dog into the unknown while you're dying. I think he believed it, he said finally. I think he had to believe it, and I think Ruby knew what she needed to do. Sometimes that has to be enough. Emma nodded slowly, then placed the pocket watch gently on the fresh earth of her grandfather's grave. I want him to have it back, she said. It was his, and Grandma gave it to him, and I want him to keep it. Emma, Jake started, but she shook her head. I have the locket from Mama. That's enough to remember them both. And I have the saddle and the quilt. I don't need the watch. He should have something of his own. It was a gesture of such pure grace that Jake felt his throat tighten. This child who'd lost everything was still finding ways to give, still thinking about what others needed rather than what she'd lost. They walked back down the hill toward town, Ruby trotting ahead, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. The funeral had been hard but necessary. Emma had said goodbye to her grandfather properly, had seen him laid to rest with dignity. That mattered. That would help in the healing that lay ahead. But as they reached Main Street, Jake felt a weight settling over him that had nothing to do with grief. The funeral was over, but the future remained unclear. Emma was getting stronger every day, more aware, more present. Soon, maybe already, people would start asking harder questions. Where would Emma live permanently? Who was her legal guardian? What about school? About healthcare? About all the things a child needed that a broken-down cowboy living in a room above a general store couldn't provide? Jake had made promises, but promises weren't always enough. The world had rules, systems, procedures. Sooner or later, those systems would turn their attention to Emma McCrae. And when they did, what claim did Jake have? He wasn't family. He wasn't a foster parent. He was just a man who'd happened to be in the right place when a dog came looking for help. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jake sat at the small table and stared at the wall. Martha had left them a casserole for dinner, and the dishes sat clean in the rack, and everything looked peaceful and domestic and temporary. Doc Henley knocked softly and came in when Jake called. The doctor settled into the other chair with a sigh, looking tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She did well today, the doc said. Strong girl. Her grandfather raised her right. He did, Jake agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, both men knowing there was a conversation that needed to happen, but neither quite ready to start it. Finally, Doc Henley spoke. Jake, I got a call from the county. Social services. They've heard about Emma, and they want to do a home visit, assess the situation. Make sure she's being properly cared for. Jake's stomach tightened. When? End of the week. They're sending someone named Mrs. Patterson. She's not unkind, but she's thorough. She'll want to see where Emma's staying, talk to her, talk to you, understand what the long-term plan is. The long-term plan is she stays here, Jake said, more forcefully than he intended. She stays with me. Doc Henley looked at him with sympathy. Jake, I know you care about that girl, we all do. But caring isn't enough in the eyes of the law. They'll want to know about your income, your living situation, your background. They'll want to know if you're capable of being a guardian. I'm capable. Are you? The question wasn't unkind, but it was direct. You're living in a single room, doing repair work that barely keeps you fed. You've got no experience with children. You're dealing with your own grief and your own health issues. I'm not saying you don't love Emma. I can see that you do. But love and capability aren't always the same thing. Jake looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her bed. Ruby curled at her feet. The child had already lost so much. The thought of losing her too, of watching her be taken away to some foster home where she'd be safe but unknown, cared for but not loved, it was unbearable. What do I do? He asked, and hated how lost he sounded. You be honest, Doc Henley said. With Mrs. Patterson, with Emma, with yourself. You tell them what you can provide and what you can't, and if Emma needs to go somewhere else, somewhere with more resources, no, Jake said flatly. I made her a promise. Sometimes keeping a promise means knowing when to step aside, the doctor said gently. Sometimes it means putting what's best for the child ahead of what we want for ourselves. The doctor left shortly after, and Jake sat alone in the quiet room, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. He looked at his worn hands, his shabby clothes, the sparse room that was his whole world now. What could he offer a child? What right did he have to think he could be what Emma needed? But when he looked at her sleeping face, peaceful for the first time since he'd found her in that wagon, he knew he couldn't give up without a fight. Raymond McCrae hadn't quit, even when dying. Sarah had never quit, even when the cancer was winning. And Jake had quit on life 5 years ago, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start fighting again. He had until the end of the week to figure out how to keep his promise. It would have to be enough. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday, driving a black sedan that looked out of place on Dustwater's dusty streets. Jake was in the workshop. He'd been spending more time there during the day, while Emma rested, trying to catch up on repairs he'd neglected, when Pete came hurrying over with news that someone was asking about Emma McCrae. Jake found the stranger in Doc Henley's office, a woman in her 40s, wearing a business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She had the look of someone from the city, polished, professional, efficient. She introduced herself as Caroline Westbrook, attorney at law from Denver. "Mr. Tiller?" she asked, extending a hand. "I understand you're the one caring for Emma McCrae." Jake shook her hand warily. "I am. Who's asking?" "I represent the estate of Raymond McCrae," she said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "I've been searching for Mr. McCrae and his granddaughter for several weeks. When I heard about the burial here in Dustwater, I came immediately. I have important information regarding Emma's future." Doc Henley had stayed for the conversation, and now he gestured for everyone to sit. Caroline Westbrook arranged her papers on the desk with practiced efficiency, then looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. McCrae contacted me 6 months ago," she began. "He came to my office in Denver with a very specific request. He wanted to make arrangements for Emma in case something happened to him. He'd been diagnosed with a heart condition, you see. The doctors gave him a year, maybe 2. He knew he was living on borrowed time." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "He knew he was dying?" "Yes, and he wanted to ensure Emma would be taken care of. That's why I'm here." She pulled out a document, official-looking with multiple pages. "Raymond McCrae left a will, and in that will, he made provisions for Emma's care and upbringing." The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jake's mind was racing, trying to understand what this meant, trying to see where this was heading. "First," Caroline continued, "you should know that Raymond had more resources than his circumstances might have suggested. He sold his property in Wyoming for a substantial sum, almost $300,000. That money is held in trust for Emma, to be used for her education, her care, and her future." Jake blinked. $300,000. Raymond McCrae, dying by the side of a road because he couldn't afford a doctor, had been carrying that kind of money? "He didn't use it," Caroline explained, reading the question in Jake's face. "He couldn't bring himself to. That money represented Emma's future, college, a home of her own someday, security. He'd rather die than spend Emma's inheritance on his own medical care. He was quite clear about that when we spoke. The tragedy of it hit Jake like a physical blow. Raymond had died trying to save money that was meant to save Emma, and in doing so had orphaned her. It was the kind of stubborn, self-sacrificing choice that made sense and no sense at the same time. "There's more," Caroline said, and her tone became more cautious. Raymond's daughter, Emma's mother Margaret, was estranged from her own parents. They disapproved of her marriage to Emma's father, disapproved of how she was living. When she chose to stay with her husband, despite their objections, they cut her off completely. That was 12 years ago. Emma said she never knew her father, Jake said. He died when Emma was an infant. An accident on the ranch. After his death, Margaret tried to reconcile with her parents, but they refused. Said she'd made her choices and would have to live with them. Raymond, Margaret's father-in-law, Emma's grandfather, stepped in. Raised Margaret and Emma on his own after that. Caroline paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. Margaret's parents, Emma's maternal grandparents, are Jonathan and Patricia Aldridge of Denver. Jonathan Aldridge owns Aldridge Investments, a very successful firm. The family is, well, they're quite wealthy. When Margaret died, Raymond made sure the Aldridges knew they had a granddaughter. He thought they might want to be part of Emma's life. They declined. They declined, Jake repeated, feeling anger kindle in his chest. Their own granddaughter. They said Margaret had made her bed, that they wouldn't enable what they saw as poor life choices by taking in the child. It was... Caroline's professional mask slipped slightly, showing distaste. It was cruel, frankly. But it was their decision, so what's changed? Doc Henley asked. Why are you here now? Caroline pulled out another document, this one looking more recent. 2 days ago I received this. A letter from Patricia Aldridge's attorney, inquiring about Emma's whereabouts and current living situation. It seems they've had a change of heart. They want to meet Emma, and they've expressed interest in taking custody. The words hung in the air like a threat. Jake's hands clenched into fists. They abandoned her, he said, his voice tight. They abandoned their daughter, refused to help when Margaret was dying, refused to take Emma in when she needed family. And now that Raymond's gone, now they want her? I don't pretend to understand their motivations, Caroline said. Perhaps it's genuine remorse. Perhaps they've realized what they've lost. Or perhaps... She paused. Perhaps they've learned about the money Raymond left Emma and they want control of it. There it was. The ugly truth underneath the sudden family concern. They can't have her, Jake said flatly. Emma's been through enough. She doesn't need people who only value her now that her grandfather's dead. Mr. Tiller, Caroline said gently, I understand your feelings, but the Aldridges are Emma's blood family. They have considerable resources. They can provide her with opportunities, education, a stable home. In the eyes of the law, I don't care about the eyes of the law, Jake interrupted. I care about Emma, about what's best for her. And being with people who turned their backs on her mother, who refused to help when it mattered, that's not what's best. Caroline looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. Mr. Tiller, I admire what you've done for Emma, truly, but you need to understand the reality. The Aldridges will petition for custody. They have the money to hire excellent lawyers. They have a home, stability, resources. What do you have? The question was brutal in its honesty. What did Jake have? A room above a general store, a handful of tools, a busted knee and grief that still woke him up at night. I have her trust, Jake said quietly, and I have a promise I made to her. That's worth more than money. In your eyes, perhaps, Caroline said. But in a courtroom, promises don't carry much weight against blood relations and financial security. She stood, gathering her papers. Raymond's will names me as executor of his estate and temporary guardian of Emma until permanent arrangements can be made. I'm required by law to notify all potential guardians, including the Aldridges. They'll be coming to meet Emma within the week. After that, decisions will need to be made about her future. What did Raymond want? Doc Henley asked. In his will, did he say who should care for Emma? Caroline hesitated, then pulled out one more document, a letter handwritten, sealed in an envelope. He left this. It's to be given to whoever stepped up to care for Emma in his absence. To whoever found her and chose to help. She handed the envelope to Jake. His name wasn't on it, just 2 words in careful handwriting. For Emma's guardian. He didn't know who it would be, Caroline explained. He just trusted that someone would care enough to help. And he wanted to thank them, to explain, to ask... She stopped, her composure finally cracking slightly. To ask them to love her the way he did, the way she deserves. Jake held the letter, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of everything Raymond McCrae had carried, the guilt of his daughter's estrangement, the determination to protect Emma, the hope that somehow, even in death, he could ensure her future. After Caroline left, promising to return in a few days with more information, Jake sat alone in Doc Henley's office with the unopened letter. The doctor had gone to check on a patient, giving Jake privacy, and the silence felt heavy with implications. Everything had changed. Emma wasn't just a child who needed temporary help anymore. She was an heiress, a commodity, a prize that people with power and money would fight over. The Aldridges didn't want Emma because they loved her. They'd proven that years ago. They wanted her because of what she represented now. Redemption, perhaps, or control of her inheritance, or simply the appearance of doing right by their dead daughter. Jake opened the letter with trembling fingers. Raymond's handwriting was shaky but clear. To whoever finds my Emma, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and my greatest fear has come true. I've left her alone in a world that hasn't been kind to us. I pray you're a good person. I pray Emma's faith in humanity, which she gets from her mother, wasn't misplaced. Emma is the best thing I've ever known. When my Margaret died, Emma kept me breathing, gave me reason to keep going when I wanted to follow my daughter into the ground. She's smart and kind and stronger than any child should have to be. She deserves better than what I could give her. The money I left is for her future. Don't let anyone take it from her. Don't let anyone use her. The Aldridges, Margaret's parents, will come. They always come when there's something to gain. Don't let them have her unless she wants them. Don't let them poison her against her mother's memory. I'm asking you to do what I can't. Protect her. Love her. Give her the stable home she deserves. I don't know who you are, but if Ruby led Emma to you, then you're the right person. That dog has never been wrong about people. I'm sorry to put this burden on a stranger, but I'm also grateful. Thank you for caring when you didn't have to. Raymond McCrae. Jake read the letter twice, then a third time, feeling the weight of Raymond's trust, his desperation, his love for his granddaughter. The old cowboy had died not knowing if anyone would find Emma in time, not knowing if his final request would ever be read. But he'd trusted anyway, had to trust, because what else could he do? Jake folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He knew what he had to do now. He had to fight for Emma, not because Raymond had asked him to, though that mattered, but because Emma deserved someone who chose her for who she was, not what she had. Someone who would put her first, always. The Aldridges might have money and lawyers and blood ties, but Jake had something more important. He had Emma's trust and Raymond's faith, and a town full of people who'd already proven they'd stand by this child. It wouldn't be easy. The battle ahead would test him in ways he hadn't been tested in years. But for the first time since Sarah died, Jake Tiller had something worth fighting for, and he wasn't going to quit. Jake didn't tell Emma about the Aldridges right away. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to explain that the grandparents who'd abandoned her mother now wanted to be part of her life. It was a conversation that required care, wisdom, and a delicacy Jake wasn't sure he possessed, but Emma was perceptive. That evening, as they sat at the small table eating the stew Martha had brought up, she watched Jake with those serious eyes, and finally asked, "Something happened today, didn't it?" "Something about Grandpa?" Jake set down his spoon. There was no point in lying to her. A lawyer came. "Your grandfather had made arrangements in case something happened to him." "What kind of arrangements?" Jake took a breath. "He left you money." "Quite a bit of money, actually, from selling the ranch in Wyoming. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of, that you'd have what you needed for your future." Emma absorbed this quietly, her fingers finding the locket around her neck. "That's why he wouldn't see a doctor, isn't it?" "He was saving the money for me." The insight was painful in its accuracy. "Yes," Jake said simply. "He loved you more than his own life, Emma." She nodded slowly, and Jake could see her working through the implications, understanding the sacrifice her grandfather had made. Then she looked up at him. "That's not all, is it? There's something else." Jake pulled out Raymond's letter and slid it across the table. "Your grandfather left this. He wanted whoever took care of you to know some things about your family. About your mother's parents." Emma read the letter slowly, her expression unchanging until she got to the part about the Aldridges. Then something flickered across her face, not surprise exactly, but recognition. "Mama told me about them once," she said quietly, "when she was really sick near the end. She said her parents had money, had a big house in the city. She said they wanted her to marry someone they approved of, someone from a good family. But she loved my daddy, and they said if she married him, she was choosing poverty and hardship over security and family. And she chose your father," Jake said. "She said it was the easiest choice she ever made, that she'd rather have 1 year with Daddy than a lifetime with someone she didn't love." Emma looked up from the letter. "They never even met me. When Mama wrote to them after Daddy died, they sent back her letter unopened. Grandpa kept it. He showed me once, so I'd understand why we didn't have other family. The cruelty of that gesture, returning a grieving daughter's letter, made Jake's anger kindle fresh. The lawyer said they want to meet you now. They're coming to Dustwater. Because of the money, Emma said flatly. It wasn't a question, maybe. Or maybe they've genuinely realized what they've lost. Either way, they're coming. And they want custody. Emma's hand tightened on the letter. I don't want to live with them. Emma, I don't, she said more forcefully. They didn't want Mama and they didn't want me. Now Grandpa's gone and there's money and suddenly they care. That's not how family works. Jake felt something ease in his chest. No, he agreed. That's not how family works. You're more my family than they are, Emma said, looking at him with those clear, honest eyes. You and Martha and Doc Henley and everyone in this town. You're the ones who helped when it mattered. That's what family means. Jake reached across the table and took her hand. I'm going to fight for you, he said. But Emma, I need you to understand. They have resources I don't have. Money, lawyers, a big house. They can give you opportunities I can't. I don't care about that. You should care. You should think about your future, about college, and I care about being with people who want me because I'm me, Emma interrupted. Not because of money or guilt or whatever reason they have now. I care about staying with you if... She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. If you want me to stay. Jake felt his throat tighten. Emma, I've never wanted anything more in my life. But wanting isn't enough. The law, the system, they might not see it that way. Then we make them see it, Emma said, with a determination that reminded Jake of Raymond McCrae. We fight. Over the next few days, Dustwater prepared for the Aldridges' visit like it was preparing for battle. Martha cleaned the general store until it gleamed, as if the Aldridges' opinion mattered, even though everyone agreed it shouldn't. Tom repaired the front steps of Doc Henley's office where the meeting would take place. Pete spread the word, and soon everyone in town knew what was happening and had opinions about rich city folk coming to claim a child they'd never cared about. Caroline Westbrook returned with more information. The Aldridges would arrive on Friday with their own lawyer. They wanted to meet Emma privately, to assess the situation, to discuss Emma's future. The phrase made Jake's skin crawl. Discuss Emma's future like she was a business proposition rather than a child. They're not bad people, Caroline said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. Patricia Aldridge expressed genuine remorse when we spoke. She said she's regretted cutting off her daughter every day since Margaret died, that she wants a chance to know her granddaughter. Funny how that regret showed up right after Raymond died, Jake said. I know how it looks, Caroline admitted, but we have to give them a chance. For Emma's sake, we have to see if there's genuine change here. Jake knew she was right, even if he hated it. Emma deserved to make an informed choice, and that meant meeting these grandparents, hearing what they had to say, understanding what they offered. But it didn't mean he had to like it. The night before the Aldridges were due to arrive, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's quiet breathing and Ruby's soft snores, and thought about everything he'd built here. Not much, objectively. A room, a routine, a fragile sense of purpose. But to him, it was everything. It was the first time in 5 years he'd felt like he mattered. Emma had done that. Given him back his reason for waking up, for trying, for caring, and now people with more money and more power wanted to take her away, wrap her up in privilege and security and probably good intentions, and he was supposed to just let them. Around midnight he heard movement. Emma sitting up in bed, Ruby's head in her lap. Can't sleep either? Jake asked softly. I'm scared, Emma admitted. What if they're nice? What if they really do care, and I'm supposed to feel grateful, but all I feel is angry? Jake sat up, his knee protesting, and crossed to her bed. He sat on the edge, and Emma leaned against his shoulder. Being angry doesn't make you ungrateful, he said. They hurt your mother. They hurt you by extension. You're allowed to be angry about that, but what if they've changed? What if they really want to make it right? Then that's good. But Emma, making it right doesn't mean you have to go live with them. Making it right means respecting what you want, what you need. If they can't do that, then they haven't really changed at all. Emma was quiet for a moment. Do you think Mama would want me to give them a chance? It was the hardest question she could have asked. Jake thought about it carefully. I think your Mama would want you to be safe and loved. If your grandparents can offer that, really offer it, not just promise it, then maybe. But I also think she'd want you to trust your own judgment. You're old enough to know when someone's being genuine and when they're not. I trust you, Emma said simply. Whatever happens tomorrow, I trust you to help me figure it out. The weight of that trust settled over Jake like Raymond's letter had. Heavy, precious, terrifying. He put his arm around Emma's thin shoulders and held her close. This child who'd lost everything, but somehow still had faith in people, still had hope. We'll figure it out together, he promised. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this. Friday arrived with clear skies and a wind that smelled like distant rain. Jake helped Emma dress in clothes Martha had bought, not fancy but nice, presentable. Emma insisted on wearing her mother's locket, and Jake didn't argue. It was her armor, her reminder of who she came from. They arrived at Doc Henley's office to find Caroline Westbrook already there, along with Martha, who'd insisted on being present as a character witness. The doctor had arranged chairs in his examination room, cleared away medical equipment, made it as welcoming as a room that usually dealt with illness and injury could be. At exactly 10 o'clock, a car pulled up outside. Not the black sedan Caroline drove, but a silver Mercedes that probably cost more than Jake had earned in the past 5 years combined. The door opened, and Patricia Aldridge emerged. She was in her early 60s, Jake guessed, dressed in expensive clothes that looked uncomfortable in Dustwater's casual atmosphere. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable. Behind her came Jonathan Aldridge, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jake's truck used to be worth back when he'd owned a truck. But what struck Jake most was the woman's face when she saw Emma. The careful composure cracked, and genuine emotion flooded through. Shock, grief, recognition. Because Emma looked like her mother, and Patricia Aldridge was seeing the daughter she'd lost, reflected in the granddaughter she'd never met. Oh, Patricia breathed, her hand going to her mouth. Oh, Margaret! Emma stood very still, holding Ruby's collar, watching her grandmother with wary eyes. The resemblance worked both ways. Jake could see Margaret in Patricia's features, could see where Emma's dark hair and serious eyes had come from. Jonathan Aldridge recovered faster, stepping forward with his hand extended. Emma, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this must be difficult. Emma didn't take his hand. My name is Emma McCrae, she said quietly. Not Emma Aldridge. The correction was gentle but firm, and Jake felt a surge of pride. This child had steel in her spine. Of course, Jonathan said, lowering his hand. McCrae, your grandfather's name. My grandfather who raised me, Emma said. Who loved me? Who died trying to take care of me. Patricia had recovered her composure somewhat, though her eyes were still bright with unshed tears. We know, she said softly, and we're so sorry, Emma. Sorry we weren't there for your mother. Sorry we weren't there for you. We've made terrible mistakes, and we need a chance to make amends. Why now? Emma asked. The bluntness of the question seemed to surprise the Aldridges. You didn't want Mama when she was alive. You didn't want me when Grandpa wrote to you. Why do you want me now? It was the question at the heart of everything, and Jake watched the Aldridges carefully to see how they'd answer. This moment would tell them everything they needed to know. Patricia looked at her husband, then back at Emma, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that seemed genuine. Because we're cowards, she said simply. Because we were so afraid of being wrong about your father, about your mother's choices, that we dug in and refused to see reason. And by the time we realized how wrong we were, how much we'd lost, your mother was gone. We convinced ourselves that you were better off without us, that we'd done too much damage to be any good to you. Then Raymond died, Jonathan added, and we realized we were about to lose you too. Lose our last connection to Margaret. And we couldn't let that happen without at least trying. It was a better answer than Jake had expected. Honest, at least partially. But he still saw the calculation in Jonathan's eyes. Still felt the sense that this was about more than just grief and regret. The real conversation was about to begin. And Jake positioned himself beside Emma, his hand on her shoulder, ready to fight for the child who'd somehow become his reason for living again. The conversation that followed was careful, measured, and tense. The Aldridges spoke about their home in Denver, a large house with a room that could be Emma's, a good school district, opportunities for music lessons, art classes, travel. They spoke about wanting to honor Margaret's memory by giving her daughter everything Margaret herself had been denied. Jake watched Emma's face throughout, trying to read her reaction. She listened politely, asked a few questions, but remained guarded. Ruby stayed pressed against her leg, and Emma's hand stayed on the dog's head, drawing comfort from the contact. "We know we can't replace your grandfather," Patricia said. "We wouldn't try to. But we can give you a family again, Emma. A home. You wouldn't have to worry about money or your future. You could just be a child." "I stopped being just a child when Mama died," Emma said quietly. Maybe before that. The truth of that statement hung in the air. Patricia's face crumpled slightly, and she looked away, composing herself. Jonathan leaned forward. "We want to do right by you, Emma, by Margaret. We failed her, but we won't fail you. You'd have every advantage, every opportunity, a real future. And what about Jake?" Emma asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard. "Mr. Tiller has been very kind," Patricia said carefully. "We're grateful to him for helping you. But Emma, he's a stranger. We're your family." "He's not a stranger," Emma said, her voice gaining strength. "He's the person who came when Ruby asked for help. He's the person who kept his promise. He's the person who's been there every day since Grandpa died, making sure I'm okay, making sure I'm safe. That makes him more family than blood does." Jake felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak, to support Emma, but this moment was hers. "We can give you so much more than—" Jonathan started, then stopped, seeming to realize how his words sounded. "More than what?" Emma challenged. "More than love. More than someone who wants me for me, not because they feel guilty or because they want to fix their mistakes." "That's not fair," Patricia said, though her voice was weak. "Isn't it?" Emma stood up, and despite her small size, she commanded the room. "You want to know what's not fair? My mama dying without ever hearing you say you were sorry. My grandpa dying alone because he gave everything he had to take care of me. That's what's not fair." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper Jake hadn't seen before. "I found this in Grandpa's things. The letter Mama sent you after Daddy died. The one you sent back unopened." Emma unfolded the letter with shaking hands. It was worn, creased from being opened and read many times. "Grandpa kept it. I think he read it when he missed her." "Do you want to know what she said?" Patricia's face had gone pale. "Emma, she said she was sorry for disappointing you," Emma continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She said she knew you thought she'd made bad choices, but that she'd never regretted loving Daddy. She said she had a daughter now, a beautiful little girl, and she hoped someday you'd want to meet her. She said she forgave you for cutting her off, and she hoped you could forgive her for choosing love over money." Tears were streaming down Patricia's face now. "We never read it. I didn't know. You didn't want to know," Emma said, not unkindly, just honestly. "And that's the difference. Jake wanted to know. He wanted to help. He didn't care that I was a stranger's kid, or that helping me would be hard, or that he didn't have much to give. He just cared that someone needed him." She turned to Jake, and he saw in her eyes a clarity that went beyond her years. "You asked what Mama would want. I think she'd want me to choose the people who choose me, not because they have to, but because they want to." Emma looked back at her grandparents. "I don't hate you," she said. "I don't even blame you, not really. People make mistakes, but you don't get to show up now and erase the years you weren't there by offering me things Grandpa would have given me if he could. Money doesn't make you my family. Being there when it matters, that's what makes family." The room was silent. Outside, Jake could hear a crow calling, the wind rattling the window. Inside, 6 people, 7 counting Ruby, sat with the weight of Emma's words settling over them. Jonathan Aldridge looked at his wife, then at Emma, and for the first time Jake saw something crack in the man's composure. Not anger, but understanding. Perhaps even respect. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everything you said is right. We don't deserve you, Emma. Your mother didn't deserve how we treated her. And you don't deserve to have us walk in now and expect you to just accept us because we're blood." Patricia wiped her eyes, nodding. "We wanted to fix our mistakes," she said. "But you can't fix the past. You can only try to do better going forward." She looked at Jake for the first time since they'd entered the room. Really looked at him. "You love her," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am," Jake said simply. "I do. And you'll take care of her. Give her a good life?" "The best life I can give," Jake said. "It won't be fancy and it won't be easy. But she'll be loved and she'll be safe and she'll always know someone's in her corner." Patricia nodded slowly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small jewelry box. She opened it to reveal a ring, simple, elegant, with a single small diamond. "This was Margaret's," she said softly. "Her grandmother's ring. I kept it thinking, hoping I'd have a chance to give it to her someday. But I never did." She held the box out to Emma. "I'd like you to have it. Not as a bribe, not as a way to buy your forgiveness. Just as a reminder that your mother was loved, even if we didn't show it the way we should have." Emma looked at the ring for a long moment, then carefully took the box. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We won't fight you for custody," Jonathan said, looking at Jake. "If Emma wants to stay with you, we'll respect that. But," he paused, "we'd like to be part of her life if she'll let us. Visits, maybe. Letters. A chance to know our granddaughter, even if we don't deserve it." Jake looked at Emma, waiting for her decision. This was hers to make. Emma held the ring box, looked at her grandparents, these flawed, regretful people who'd hurt her mother, but now sought redemption, and made her choice. "I'd like that," Emma said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I'd like to know you, not because you're replacing Grandpa, or because you can give me things, but because you loved my mama once, and maybe we can figure out how to be family the right way this time." Patricia let out a sob and covered her mouth with her hand. Jonathan's jaw worked and he nodded several times, unable to speak. "But I'm staying with Jake," Emma continued, turning to look at him. "This is my home now. Dustwater is my home. These people, they're my family. That doesn't change." Jake felt something inside him break open, not break apart, but break open the way dawn breaks open the night. He pulled Emma into a hug, and she wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight. Ruby pressed against both of them, tail wagging, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Caroline Westbrook, who'd been quietly observing throughout, spoke up. "There are legal matters to address. Emma's guardianship, the trust fund, how to formalize these arrangements. But if everyone is in agreement about the primary custody going to Mr. Tiller, we can work through the details. We'll cover any costs," Jonathan said immediately. Looking at Jake, "Legal fees, whatever modifications you need to make to your living situation to accommodate Emma properly. And the trust, Emma's money, we won't touch it. That's hers for her future, just as Raymond intended. We can set up regular visits," Patricia added, her voice still thick with emotion. "Maybe Emma could come stay with us during school breaks if she wants. Or we could come here. Whatever works best for her." Martha, who'd been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. "Dustwater takes care of its own," she said firmly. "Emma's one of ours now, but having family who care, that's good too. Children need all the love they can get." Doc Henley nodded agreement. "We'll make this work. All of us together. That's how community functions." The rest of the meeting was spent working through practicalities. Caroline explained the legal process for Jake to become Emma's legal guardian, what documentation would be needed, what home studies might be required. The Aldridges provided contact information, discussed potential visit schedules, and made it clear they wanted to contribute to Emma's welfare without overstepping. When the Aldridges finally left, promising to return in a month for a visit, the tension in the room eased. Emma sagged against Jake, exhausted from the emotional weight of the morning. "You did good," Jake told her quietly. "Your mama would be proud of you. You think so?" "I know so. You stood up for yourself, but you also showed grace." "That's not easy." Emma pulled back and looked up at him. "Are you sure about this? About being my guardian? It's going to be complicated and expensive and—" "Emma," Jake interrupted gently, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You're my family now. That's all that matters." That afternoon, the town celebrated in its quiet way. Martha closed the store early and made a proper meal. Pot roast with all the fixings, enough to feed everyone who'd been involved in the morning's drama. They gathered in the room above the store, crowding around the small table, passing dishes, and sharing relief that things had worked out. Pete raised his glass of water in a toast. "To Emma," he said, "and to doing what's right even when it's complicated. To family," Tom added. "The kind you choose and the kind that chooses you." They clinked glasses and Emma smiled, a real smile, the first Jake had seen since she'd arrived in Dustwater. It transformed her face, made her look young and hopeful, instead of old beyond her years. After everyone left and the dishes were washed, Jake and Emma sat by the window watching the sun set over the valley. Ruby lay at their feet, content and peaceful. "Jake," Emma said softly, "yeah? What happens now? I mean, after all the legal stuff is done and everything's settled, what does our life look like?" Jake thought about that question. A month ago, he'd have said his life was over, that he was just marking time until his own end came. And now everything was different. "I think," he said slowly, "we figure it out as we go. You'll go to school, make friends. I'll keep doing repair work, maybe expand the business a bit now that I've got reason to. We'll have dinner together every night, take Ruby for walks, visit your grandparents sometimes. We'll just live, build a life together day by day." "That sounds good," Emma said. "That sounds really good." She leaned against his shoulder and Jake put his arm around her. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Raymond McCrae was at rest, his granddaughter safe and loved. Somewhere out there, Sarah was watching too, Jake liked to think, pleased that he'd finally found his way back to living. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, complications, moments of doubt. But sitting there with Emma beside him and Ruby at their feet, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. Real solid hope that tomorrow would be better than today. That the future held promise instead of just more empty days. He'd been given a second chance at having purpose, at mattering, at being the kind of man he'd always meant to be. And he wasn't going to waste it. Ready for bed? He asked Emma. "In a minute," she said. "I just want to watch the stars a little longer." So they sat together in the growing darkness, this makeshift family bound not by blood, but by choice, by circumstance, by a dog's desperate journey through dust and heat to find the one person who would answer her plea for help. And in that moment, watching the stars emerge one by one over Dustwater, Jake Tiller was exactly where he was meant to be. 6 months later, Dustwater looked much the same as it always had. The same faded storefronts, the same quiet streets, the same handful of stubborn souls refusing to let the town die completely. But if you looked closer, you'd notice small changes. Fresh paint on the church steeple, new flower boxes outside the general store, the sound of a child's laughter echoing down Main Street on Saturday mornings. Emma had settled into life in Dustwater like she'd always belonged there. She attended the small school in Millbrook, riding there each morning with Tom Bradshaw, who made the drive anyway for supplies. Her teachers reported she was bright, diligent and kind, a child who'd seen hardship but hadn't let it harden her. She'd made friends, though she still preferred the company of adults and Ruby to children her own age. Some things, Jake figured, just took time. The legal arrangements had been finalized without much fuss. Caroline Westbrook had handled everything with quiet efficiency, and the Aldridges had been true to their word. They provided financial support without strings attached, visited once a month, and gave Emma space to grow into whatever relationship she was comfortable with. Patricia sent letters between visits, sharing stories about Margaret's childhood, filling in pieces of Emma's history that had been lost. Jonathan set up a college fund in addition to Raymond's trust, making it clear Emma would have choices when the time came. But it was Jake who read to Emma at night, who helped with homework, who sat with her when nightmares woke her, remembering the heat and thirst of those days in the wagon. It was Jake who taught her to repair leather the way his father had taught him, who showed her how to read the sky for weather, who told her stories about Sarah and listened to her stories about Raymond. It was Jake who was there day after day, choosing to be her father in all the ways that mattered. The room above the store had become a proper home. Martha had helped them paint the walls a warm yellow that Emma chose. They'd gotten a small bookshelf for Emma's growing collection, and Jake had built a proper desk where she did her homework. Pictures dotted the walls now. Emma and Jake at the county fair, Emma with Ruby, a photo of Raymond that Carolyn had found in his belongings. And in a place of honor above Emma's bed, the quilt her mother had made, carefully preserved and still used on cold nights. Jake's workshop had expanded too. Word had spread about his skill with leatherwork, and orders came from farther afield now. He'd hired Pete part-time to help with simpler repairs, giving the old man purpose and pocket money. The work was steady, enough to support Emma properly and even save a little. Jake had opened a bank account for the first time in years, started planning for things beyond next week, started believing in a future again. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Jake and Emma walked up to the cemetery. They'd made it a ritual, visiting once a month. Sarah's grave and Raymond's, tending both, bringing wildflowers when they bloomed. Ruby trotted ahead, older now but still spry, still watching over Emma with devoted eyes. They stopped first at Raymond's grave. Emma set down a bouquet of early wildflowers and touched the wooden cross Tom had carved. Jake had plans to replace it with a proper stone marker once he'd saved enough, but Emma said her grandfather wouldn't have cared about that. He'd just care that she was happy. "I told my teacher about Grandpa yesterday," Emma said. "About how he raised horses and how he took care of me after Mama died. She said he sounded like a hero." "He was," Jake agreed. "I told her you were a hero too," Emma continued, "for taking me in even though you didn't have to." Jake shook his head. "I'm no hero, Emma. I just did what anyone decent would do." "That's what makes you a hero," Emma said with the simple wisdom she'd inherited from her grandfather. "Heroes are just regular people who do the right thing when it would be easier not to." They moved to Sarah's grave next, and Jake knelt to brush away fallen leaves, to straighten the small ceramic angel Martha had placed there years ago. He hadn't been able to visit for so long, paralyzed by grief and shame. But now, with Emma beside him, he could talk to Sarah in his mind, tell her about this child who'd given him back his purpose, thank her for the years they'd had together. "Do you think they know each other now?" Emma asked quietly. "Grandpa and Sarah, up there wherever they are?" "I'd like to think so," Jake said. "I'd like to think they're watching out for us together." Emma slipped her hand into his. "I think they are, and I think they're happy we found each other." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new grass and possibility. Then Ruby barked, ready to head back down the hill, and they followed her back toward town. As they walked down Main Street, Pete waved from his bench outside the store. Martha came out with fresh cookies, pressing them into Emma's hands with a warm smile. Doc Henley called a greeting from his porch. Tom's truck rumbled past, and he honked twice in hello. These small gestures, these moments of connection, this was what community meant, what family meant. That evening, after Emma had finished her homework and they'd eaten dinner together at their small table, Jake sat in his chair by the window while Emma read on her bed. Ruby curled at her feet. The lamp cast warm light over them, and outside the window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Jake thought about the morning Ruby had dragged that saddle into his life, thought about finding Emma in that wagon, thought about all the moments since that had led them here. He thought about Raymond McCrae's letter, about the trust that old Cowboy had placed in a stranger, about the faith that sometimes good people show up when you need them. He thought about second chances, about how life could surprise you when you'd given up on surprises, about how purpose could find you even when you'd stopped looking for it, About how family wasn't always the one you were born into, but sometimes the one you built from kindness and circumstance and choice. "Jake," Emma said, looking up from her book. "Yeah? I'm glad Ruby chose you." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "So am I, Emma, so am I." She smiled and went back to her book. And Jake watched her, this child who'd lost everything but still had hope, still had love to give, still believed in goodness and felt grateful in a way that went bone deep. The road that had brought them together had been hard, marked by loss and grief and struggle. But sitting here now, in this room full of light and warmth and the simple comfort of being together, Jake knew that every hard mile had been worth it. Sometimes the ones who've lost everything are the only ones who can truly save someone else. But the truth Jake had learned was deeper than that. Sometimes, in saving someone else, you save yourself too. Outside, Dustwater settled into evening quiet. Inside, a makeshift family that had chosen each other continued building their life together. Day by precious day, moment by moment, creating something neither of them could have found alone, but both of them needed more than they'd ever known. And Ruby, faithful Ruby, who'd carried a burden far too heavy for her small frame, and led it to exactly the right person, slept peacefully at the foot of Emma's bed, her work finally done.